anything, but hopefully this kind of will show you guys, I don't know, like just a little bit about like the process that I go through, the team goes through, and all that kind of stuff in regards to Borderlands. I'll give you like a little bit of history before we jump into stuff. As far as today, the few things that I wanted to, when I created this presentation, I didn't account for a big thing in half of it, so I apologize for anybody that's on either side. So some of the things we're going to go over today is like kind of the what, I'm going to kind of do a high level of characters, environments, and guns in the game. It's kind of the three biggest things that mean something to me in the game. A bit of the why of some of the rationale behind some of the choices and the reasons that myself or the team kind of does to make this, to work on this franchise, and a little bit of the workflow and techniques. Again, I'm not going to go crazy technical, if somebody's really excited about that, like that's another talk that one of my guys would do that would do a much better job than I. We'll do like a really quick bio here, just to give you guys a little bit of context of me. These are, if any of this means anything to you, then hooray, you know a lot about me. If it doesn't, it's not. Music and games have always been a part of me. This picture I had Templeton doing this 1-footer hung on my wall for so long. This is a huge inspiration. Skateboarding, I spent the majority of my life doing. It's kind of made me look at the world a little different, and the terrain and all those things. Akira is my favorite movie, my favorite comic of all time. Blame, one of my second favorite comic of all time. Bingus, CRMK, all these Capcom artists. Basically, I was fueled by basically the 90s artists that were coming out of Capcom and SNK. That meant a lot to me and sort of built a lot into who I am and the way I look at art. I've been at Gearbox for 12 years. On Borderlands 1 and 2, I was the main character concept designer, so all the Vault Hunters and all the NPCs and stuff were me. I moved in, I art directed a game called Battleborn. Super near and dear to me. Game tanked, did awful. Overwatch kind of killed us, but I'm still proud of the effort we put into that game. Those characters still mean a lot to me. Again, that was my fighting game, if you will, as you can see from this. And so on Borderlands 3, I moved into the art director role. So I've been on part of the franchise for, gosh, since the first game, so I think I know it pretty well. So if any of my words have any validity to it, well, there you go. Well, quick thing about the studio, we do have 2 locations. We have one in Quebec, and we have one in Frisco. You know, we're known for Brothers in Arms, Borderlands, Battleborn. We're hiring now, so if you're interested in any of those things, go check out the website. You can talk to me afterwards. I'm totally cool to talk or catch up with anybody if I don't cover anything you guys are interested in. So the first thing I did want to kind of talk about the art style, it's kind of one of the things that just is most synonymous, you know, other than like the guns and the loot and stuff in our game. I think most people recognize it for its visuals. So it was really important to me that it's a hand-drawn moving comic book. I love comics. I worked in the comic book industry for 6 or 7 years before I landed at Gearbox, doing a myriad of all sorts of things from coloring to backgrounds to characters. No one really liked my art in the comic book world, so it was... I found a better home in games, I guess we'll say that. So inks are super important, as I have a love of ink, traditional ink, digital ink, whatever it is. So the inks are kind of our definition of everything. We have a black Sobel outline. The only thing that's actually procedural about any of our art is the outline that draws around our characters. The game is not cell shaded. People call it that. It doesn't bother me. Cell shading is actually my favorite form of art. But I would tell you that the game, it's particularly BL3 too. It's all PBR. There's no clamping of values in any of the lighting or anything like that. So in regards to that, it's actually, you know, kind of more realistic than stylized in my opinion. And going into that, you know, we consider it's not realistic, but it's not a cartoon. It's a little bit in between. I don't take offense to any of those terms, but like we do have a tendency to put more detail and information and things than most people would considering a stylized game. And I think one thing for us was important was just kind of making our own lane visually. Around the time we shift the Borderlands art style, actually, I'll just go ahead and go to this slide. This is what the game used to look like. Some of you have probably seen it in the past. And this is BL1. This is 2008, I guess. The game looked like this. When I started at Gearbox, I started as a UI developer, actually. I was building the interface for this game, and I shifted into art and all sorts of art direction and things. But one of the main reasons we changed is down the street from us is a little company called id. You know, I'm sure you've heard of them. They were doing a game called Rage. There was no way we could compete with with Carmack and these, just the artists and stuff that were over there. So we were like, man, we need to do something different because our game looked bland. It looked boring. It was a product of kind of what I would call that Unreal generation of that era, where everything was a little muddy, everything was a little brown. So we needed to do something to kind of do that. So the funny thing is, as we sort of developed that style, we realized that it fit the gameplay a lot better. We had characters with 8-foot verticals, all this kind of stuff. In a photoreal game that you were doing that just didn't really make any sense, right? So I put excitement and terror on there because we rebuilt the entire game in about 7 months. We redid as many pieces of art as we could possibly redo. We re-inked all these assets. We relaid out almost every level. We threw that game together. So it was actually very exciting and terrifying, and it was my first game professionally, which I thought was great. But again, that's a whole nother talk that would be probably interesting to some people and maybe not as much to others. I kind of have, I apologize for the amount of crap that I'm throwing on a lot of these screens. I'm trying to cram a lot into this talk here. So I kind of have this thing when, one of the things that's really important to me in this franchise is really pushing the personality and style and anything that we see in there, and that the artist's hand is always present. Like ink is, every single asset is hand done by somebody. There's no procedural generation. There's no, part of the look of the game is the pain that has gone into sitting there inking it. Traditionally, the first times we did tests for the first game, actually, I would take the textures, I would print them out, and I would actually hand ink them on a light box. And we did, some of the textures there in the first game are actually done that way. But we got to a point where it was just too time consuming to scan it back in and line it up. And here's the thing, a lot of artists, no offense, are not illustrators. They're not actually concept artists. And actually, a lot of my concept artists aren't inkers. They're painters, right? So that was a powerful, important lesson to learn, that I could just do all these textures, but very few other people could until they kind of got better at it. Now they're all way better than me at it. Shape, language, and silhouette are kind of paramount to me, from the characters to the environments and all those things. These are all tenets that I think are important for any game, let alone our game. We put a lot of exaggeration into our forms and our breaks, and breaks to me are just like areas where a big element hits another element. I've got a couple diagrams of some of that stuff. So some of my dialogue is stupid, so I apologize for that. I do try to tell a story with each asset, even the tiniest little hammers, the way that something was cracked and there's like tape wrapped around it or something. Like I kind of encourage the people to put a little something into that. Most people aren't going to see that, but they feel it. If it's not there, they'll notice it's not there. But if it is there, they just might not notice it. But I think that's cool. You know, we're leaning to color and light and mood. The first game was pretty monochromatic, and as we've gone to BL2 and BL3, we really kind of put a lot of effort into color and light and mood and just atmosphere and what that means to us to evoke emotion and whatnot. And I think, too, one thing was to be comfortable in our own skin. I think we were trying to be something that we weren't, and I think this is an important lesson to everybody that's in art. Like, love what you love and don't be ashamed of it, you know? And don't feel like you have to fit into like a certain mold. And we certainly didn't. And I think that let into heart and soul. It kind of let us be us, and it let my, our personalities kind of like, get into that and become part of that. But on top of that, there are a couple rules that we do in this franchise, at least. It does need to be relatable. I have the concept of boots on the ground. It needs to make sense. Like, it can't just be technology that's just like weird floating orbs for no reason. We have to have a description for that. I kind of have this comment, not too weird, but not too mundane. Like, I just think it's really important for our franchise that it was like the technology and the objects and the things, even if we're like teleporting and digistructing people back to life and stuff, there's still kind of a means to it and there's an explanation for it. And I think that's important for us. That goes into like architecture and technology. Like, a building has to kind of structure in a way that makes sense. We can't just like do weird amoeba shapes and things. Like, it's important to us for that. Also, style's not an excuse to like bullshit. Just because you put a style on something doesn't mean you can just fake like connection points and the way like clothing works and things. So I think a lot of people think style is just an excuse to not have to do work. I think it's actually the opposite, in my opinion. So signage that connects, it's something that I'll talk about in a little bit, that signs are a really quick connection to like humans that like convey messages, but also ground areas and things. Also, the game might be funny. It's not really a joke. We don't really think like anything we're doing is just stupid. Like, it's kind of there for a reason. If it's a joke, it's because it's part of the world. It's not because it's like us. And now, granted, I'm not talking about the writing here. So if you have issues with that, that's not me. I'm talking about the art and the way that all this kind of goes into. So we talk about characters for a minute. Again, this is kind of a high level thing. each game we've put new Vault Hunters in, we put new NPCs, we put all that kind of stuff into the game because like I love making characters and so does the company. We do have like a handful of rules that I kind of go with in this. And you're going to see a lot of this repeated between the different areas and even the stuff I already said. So again, I'm kind of beating things into people's head just because it's important to me at least. Unique shape, language, and body type across the characters. It's something that we've tried. I think we've done a little better than the majority of our competitors in regards to that. But it's something that's important to me. Again, the personality and attitude. Asymmetric chunks is a big thing. I have a screen that kind of will break down a little bit of that. It usually just means put a big dumb thing here and put another one here so that there's like a eye flow that kind of connects you through the thing and grounds it. Thick to thin breaks, I kind of talked about that. Diagonal zigzag eye flow, I have a screen that makes more sense of that. But one thing that's important to me is typically a 70-30 balance. That means like 70% of the character is one thing and 30% is the other thing. But that 30% typically is the thing that stands out. Here, I'll kind of show you what I mean. I take a character like Mose, and I put these keyboards back up. Or from the shape language, you know, you've kind of got these, you know, these kind of weirder forms that definitely stand out. Then those happen to be the asymmetric chunks that kind of create, you know, ununiformity, if you will. It's sort of like, you know, just separates those things, you know, those thick breaks, you know, where these elements meet and bunch up, you know, It's really pretty rudimentary. When you really start to look at all this in this, it's like very, you know, simple. Again, the 70-30, these things that are really the 70% have a tendency to dominate the whole character, right? Whereas the 70% of it is actually pretty mundane, but those elements are the thing that make the character special. You talk about that eye flow, and again, this character is too complicated in my opinion. It's my fault. But like, you know, you kind of watch as the eye flows through, and it usually just has a natural tendency to kind of take you through the character as opposed to that. And again, you know, this is always the most important part of a character. It's the way we connect to them. A character's head is the connection to their body, which is the connection to the world around them. If you have a compelling character, chances are your environment is going to, you know, bend off of that, and that's what's going to draw people into that. We show some NPCs here again, kind of just talking about the things that I said as far as the eye flow, the asymmetric chunks, the, you know, the different body types and shapes and forms. You know, these, I don't need to go into this. I think it kind of speaks for itself. You go into the Vault Hunters, you know, in this game. Again, everything I just said, and you look at Zane, and you're like, oh, wow, this guy doesn't know. He has one trick, you know, big thing here, you know, like how this connection like kind of flows down and kind of completes the character. So Beastmaster's too cool to look at us, so he's not really showing that. But again, you're seeing these big breaks and pieces and shapes and elements of all that kind of, you know, blend into that. So if you go look at Borderlands 1 and 2, I mean, I use all these same tricks and stuff. You look at Roland, you look at Axton, you look at all those, they have a very similar thing. It kind of just turned into what we do. Doesn't mean we don't always break that. Again, characters like Zero are pretty symmetrical, but then, again, when we do those things, it's to give a different emotion. It's to kind of like tell a different story, like in regards to this. Today, though, I was going to put a little effort and kind of just talked about a character breakdown that when we developed the Calypso twins. Some of this might be kind of rudimentary, but I'm only really going to do it in one example here, but I still think it's kind of interesting to see where we start and where we went to. So we'll start with inspiration. It's pretty obvious, you know, I wanted a Diarntwood, you know, relationship between the two. We had a very MIA influence thing. I'm obsessed with Tekken Concrete and Black and White, and I wanted the color schemes to be very separate between them, but I also wanted the relationship between Akira and Tetsuya, between these two characters. So you had the thing that's, I think is interesting about this is I never reference video games, like ever. I always look outside of it. I look at life, I did fashion illustration for a while. Fashion is a personal thing that I love. So we kind of tried to take these things that, you know, are a little outside of games that you don't see represented a lot, and we kind of use this as kind of like our kind of idea point. And I just think it's important that a lot of people and artists I know, they're like, I want to draw fantasy, and all they do is look at other fantasy art. I'm like, dude, it's going to look like that, you know, like go look at like modern society or go look at other things to influence that. So, you know, we take the inspiration, we do a concept phase. Here's some sketches. This is Sergey, if you guys are familiar with him. I couldn't do all the characters in this game, so Sergey kind of came in and he was my hands, which is great because his hands are way better than mine. So he was able to take my thoughts and ideas and things and really put his own twist onto that stuff. And he's been just a great contributor and friend of mine now that's kind of helped us kind of really, you know, be my hands when I had to work with the whole team on this project. So you can see we're kind of looking at different shapes and forms and what are those elements that stand out? What feels cool? What's too much? Like what are the personalities? Again, I'm just kind of picking up a few quickly. You look at Tyrene and where we started with her and what elements. And again, we knew one of these were conjoined twins. One of them got the arm, the other one didn't. So at first we were thinking Tyrene, but we thought it made more sense to go on Troy. So you can see some of these drawings still kind of morphed between the two of them. Now, a typical thing that you'll see if you work with somebody like me or whatever is you're going to get a bunch of crap like this, a bunch of red lines and notes that go through. I'm simplifying this a lot down, by the way, so you don't have to deal with all this. But you can kind of see the elements that I'm thinking feel cool. Like these are actual notes. I've not like altered this to make me look cool or anything. Like this is the kind of stuff that I'm doing on a day-to-day. I see this kind of regal coat feels good. I start kind of bashing things together to kind of try, you know, real quick sketches of like, hey, do these guys feel cool? These three are kind of my amalgamations of a lot of Sergey's art and kind of what feels good. So we'll do a bunch of that between both characters. We get to a point where we're like, okay, we kind of like that. We're going to do turns. I know it's a little rudimentary, but there's a point to this. We start doing this and we're like, cool, we're going to do some model sheets. We're going to get these guys going. A lot of times when we're here, we feel pretty good. So we'll do a piece like this. We'll do a mood piece like, yeah, this feels awesome. These are our characters. These are our villains. This is what we're going to run with. And this is how we're going to lead, right? But like, as we started modeling them, they just didn't look right. You know, we start realizing that the arms didn't quite feel right. We needed to do a lot of revisions. So we do a lot of paint overs while the model's in flight. You can see this is a high poly, like it's been built, but the arm wasn't really working. And in fact, the jacket wasn't working. This is a thing that when I say boots on the ground, when I see all this fiddly crap, it just didn't work. Like it just got to a point where I should have called it out sooner, but I wanted to see it in the 3D. And we realized that this, I kind of call them the turkey legs. Like the baggy pants too have a tendency to have issues with rigging and things around the crotch. So we needed to make some adjustments. We needed to run from there. So we ended up kind of getting to this point where, you know, we streamlined some of the elements. The things that were important became important, and we weren't just putting shit on it just to put shit on it, if that makes any sense. Like each of those elements were important. Like what was the asymmetrical breaks? And again, this deviates a little bit from some of the things I talked about in the past, but in the last few slides, but gives you a point. But you know, there's missing a thing. And again, this goes back to I was a design student. Like it's important to me that we make iconography that connects very strongly and leaves an imprint on people. So brand identity and manufacturing is super important to me, which we'll see a little bit later in the guns here. So we do a bunch of revs. We find a thing we like. We start making a high poly. This is funny because my character artist couldn't render it without cutting his head off. So I left my notes on my slides just so you could kind of get a joke of that. We do high poly, pretty typical. High poly, a Tyrene, it's coming together. It's feeling good. We're getting, you know, textures on. Now, what I do want to kind of point out here is as the texturing process happens, this is actually really laborious for us. I wanted to break down like a couple of diffuse textures. So sorry, I'm totally in the way of this one, which is the zoom in. So you see on all these elements, like every one of these black lines, they're all drawn by human hands. Our texture process takes, I'll just say this, to create a character or asset in our franchise takes twice as long as any other game. It's painful, but it's a choice that we made to give us our look. So you can kind of see all these lines over here. I've kind of zoomed in more on some of the details so you can kind of see like all of the, you know, the artist's hand inside of there. Here's like another example of Tyrene. You know, you just look at her hair and you see the amount of lines and detail and things that we kind of put in there. The amount of colorization and diffuse, because we're using PBR and we're using comp mass and metal, you know, roughness and all these things to catch light in ways, but at the same time, it's really important that a lot of it is actually drawn by the artist. So we dictate some lighting and some things that I don't mind that contradicts with the actual accurate lighting that's in a PBR environment. I actually like we had to do some tweaks and tunes to make sure, because for a while we let it affect the inks and it looked wrong. So now all of the lighting never affects the inks in the game, which is actually pretty sweet. So if you see speck go across the leather of her jacket, for instance, the inks are always untainted because it was important to me that they weren't. So here's a shot of her with just all the inks. So you can see how much is actually, you know, like we're almost painting our own AO in a way. And we actually even do some what we call watercolor shading, and you can see some different value things that are in here that we actually go ahead. I come from like a Copic marker background, so I used a lot of grayscale markers. So we bring a lot of that into the way that the game looks. We take all that, we try another mood piece. This is pretty mid-development, so it's a little shoddy looking, but I think it's kind of cool to see, all right, now we feel pretty good about these guys moving forward. Again, you talk about inks. I do things like this. I don't know if you can really see that. Well, I'll take the models and I'll re-ink on top of it and put more detail. You take a thing like Troy's arm. This is where the inks were at. This is all the work that I start to do. And you kind of see how it comes together in the end. Again, I'm kind of beating this over your head, but it's a really important thing for us in regards to the look of the game. And then we do some final beauty shots and renders and crap, and then the characters are kind of complete, right? So I want to talk a little bit about environment stuff. One thing to me that's really important about environment, it's the biggest character on the screen. Like, I know we put a lot of effort into our characters, but like, if you're gonna see 90% of your screen, if it's a third-person game, if it's a first-person game, it doesn't matter. That's pretty much your entire, that's your thing. I used to just be totally in love with characters, and I still am, but I think through Borderlands 3, I really fell in love with environment much more so. And I realized how much more important that is, because the character doesn't mean much if the context that what they're in sucks, right? So that became a big shift for me in this game to really put a lot of effort into that. So bleeding personality, the design and shape language, you're seeing recurring patterns here, strong silhouettes, you know, the atmosphere from the biome and the skybox, you know, architectural style is really important to me. In this game, we had different planets and places. They're not going to build the exact same buildings. You know, civilizations and societies build different ways, and right? The scene framing and scene composition, the graphic design and signage, all these things are really important to me. So you get into some areas like in our game, we have space, we have, you know, Neo-Tokyo City, we've got, you know, Monastery in the Hills, we've got weird alien crypts. The interiors of spaceships, these are all concept. The last one were all in-game screenshots. You know, we've got crazy, you know, fanatic temples and other weird crypts and, you know, farmland and all that kind of stuff. So the places and the areas that we're going to in this game were a lot further than we've ever done, because we basically had done, and Borderlands 1 was desert. Borderlands 2 was, there was a little bit of snow, there was a little bit of green, and then there was desert. And for the most part, that was it. So this was an opportunity for us to flex that color and that mood. I wanted to kind of do a quick breakdown of Eden 6, one of the areas that we kind of went to on this to see what was important to us. I'll skip a lot of the inspiration and concept, and we'll just get to these pieces. These were a few concepts that got to the point where this was the goal. This is what we wanted to build. This was the areas that we wanted to make, you know, with the right amount of rocks. You know, I was kind of coining this term trees as architecture in this landscape, which was a different way for us for thinking and all those kind of things. But like, and you'll notice that in these, this is all a concept artist, Adam Ybarra. None of this is like inked. None of this really looks like the game. I think it's the one thing that's really important to understand is your art, your concept art doesn't always have to look exactly like the end product, as long as it's informing the next person in line. So almost every artist I work with, I actually hire people that all draw different. I know it sounds weird, that bring a different aspect. And I don't want a bunch of clones. I don't want a bunch of people that draw exactly the same way. Every one of our concept artists draws like totally different. If you have good art direction, and if you have a good common goal that everybody understands, like you can sort of like, you know what I mean? Like you don't need all of, you don't need everybody to be like just on sheet model like a Disney or something like that. That's one of the things I think is really important. Like a lot of the personalities and aesthetics and ideas that these people have are what's really important to me, and it's less about, you know, yeah, I want you to be able to draw well, but like, you know, beyond that. Anyway, this is a little side note. So when I think about an environment, the things that are most important to me in this one, there was three things. It was like the trees, it was the organics, right? So as you can see between all these, you see how strong the shape language and the vibe and the feel is. So here's the thing, like we're not so good at foliage as a studio. So it was really important to me that a lot of the foliage and all those things, we've never done it. I was like, I want to make a forest, I want to make a big city, and everybody freaked out. But one of the things we had to do was we had to think about bigger, like actual geo foliage, and like we know we can't compete with some, we can't be Naughty Dog, we can't like have all this crazy, you know, alpha foliage on foliage. Like our outline shader will take every single one of those edges and it puts an outline around it. We can flag things on and off as far as the foliage goes, but it'll look like a total mess. So because of the style of your game, a lot of times you have to interpret what the context of that, what that stuff might be. So in this case, you'll see, you're not seeing a lot of tiny, fine little foliage and stuff. We had to use bigger chunks of things because one, just to draw that many things on screen and the size of our maps, and it just looked terrible because of the outline shader. So we'll kind of figure out what we want to do with trees. We'll get to a point as we start to model things, we do a few more call outs. Here's like a tiling bark texture. So this was one of those times, if you see this, like, you know, that's the size of a guy, and that's the trunk, right? So for us to do that, we've got to do tiling textures. Not uncommon in the industry. What is uncommon is to have to do it with these freaking inks. So to do these things that tile, and to do it in a way that they don't look super repetitive, because most PBR source textures are, you look at this that's around us, like to do a PBR tiling of all this is like nothing, dude. You can have the same tiling thing and no one's gonna tell. You know, it's almost, we almost build our world tiling, right? You look at all these dung, 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 da, 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 da. Like we don't have that luxury on Borderlands, because if you start seeing the same ink line, like da, 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 it looks like crap. So we gotta use third channel alphas and paint over things. Again, that's more technical stuff I'm not really gonna get into. We get to this point where we build these things out. There's a lot of prototyping. There's a lot of R&D to make that stuff work. Again, a human is very, very tiny in regards to these things, but you see most of our leaves, we have some alphas and foliage, and some of that's geo actually, but most of this stuff just becomes actual geo because it's what we can render. It's what we can do. We lean into our weaknesses and just say that's what we have to do. Sometimes just brute forcing something is just like kind of a bad idea, to be honest. So I talk about the trees. You know, we talk about the rocks, and the funny story about these is these were inspired by this cacao butter, like an actual butter like one of our artists had. And we took it and we were like, oh, damn, this is awesome. Again, thinking a little outside of the box. We started taking these dramatic pictures of these chunks of butter, and those actually ended up becoming the core inspiration for the shapes of the rocks and the surface that is inside of Eden 6. So anyway, funny story there. We start to prototype. We make, you know, these are some high poly sculpts. We start thinking about how the things are going to tile. Again, what the size of these rocks are, how big we can do that. We have to go in. So now we get back into the tiling thing. This is the actual in-game tiling texture. Those few rocks are all of the rocks that make up of all that planet. So there's about 7 or 8, give or take. So that with those textures basically builds like our big, huge landscapes, not counting our terrain and all that stuff. So we start making vignettes that are up here that are all those pieces. You know, we're making sure these rocks from every angle as they rotate, they look interesting. They have a different detail. They have a different surface, so that we kit bash everything together, like literally and visually throughout our game. So again, we talk about tiling textures. Again, becomes a little difficult because when you've got quilted metal like this, the porous rocks, all these things with all the, you know, the wood shacks and shanties that we have all across, right? All these things are kind of a pain to make, and not look totally terrible. We take, you know, architecture is another one of the key tenets. Most of our planets are their terrain, you know, their rocks and their architecture. So we start to talk about, and again, this is all focused on Eden 6. So from our mansion set, from our exterior and our interior, to our shacks and shanties that are kind of all over the place, we'll get to this point where, again, I'm fast forwarding a lot of steps because of time, and it's kind of redundant, to be honest. So, but as we get into that, we start doing proxies and blockouts of all these shapes, right? Okay, we give these to the level artists, level designers. We're putting this together. Does this feel okay? It's feeling good. And as we fast forward, you know, we get to the point where that's where it ends up looking in game. But again, you're looking at this, and honestly, this is kind of an eyesore in my opinion because of the limitations of some of what we had to do and the time we had to do it. But you know, it's a simple tiling, couple Atlas textures, right? It's not uncommon in games, but to us to do it in that way and get it to that point, it takes a little more effort. I want to show you these screens because these are all different in-progress shots of Eden 6. They actually don't look that bad, but if you look at any of these things up close, you can see how bad. So these tiles on these are like 30 feet tall. But here's the thing, all these shots, this is my opinion, they actually all look pretty good because the shapes are good, because the silhouettes are interesting. Like that stuff is way more important than your detail. I know I'm sitting here talking about the detail, but each one of these assets and pieces it's kind of working, and that makes us know it's going to be okay. And when we do the extra effort to make sure that this tree that's 200 feet tall doesn't have a texture that's about a 512 that's stretched across the whole thing, is actually going to be okay. So anyway, so as we get to this point though, we realize that the high level of these things are working pretty good, but we do have a bit of an issue in that there's not a lot of personality or style. So what I have a tendency to do is I take these areas, I take these maps, and I go through, sometimes it's me, sometimes it's the artist I'm working with. We start painting over all the details that aren't there, the things that are missing. So we get into this thing where we kind of do what I consider a flavor pass. We find what are the elements that are unique to this area, this planet. What are the things that give it personality? What is the grounding, what grounds you as a player when you walk up to a table and you see something, you know, the tire with this as a life preserver and this kind of thing, the sharktopus weird ceramic thing that somebody put over their fishing hut, right? You know, the chainsaw that's still kind of like because we're kind of techie and stuff too. What is that? But, you know, the one thing I wanted to say is like signs are shortcuts. Like they're great ways. So I had these rules on all these planets. On Eden 6, every sign was hand painted. Everything was, there was an artist, a guy that would go through and one dude would paint all the signs in all of the place. On Pandora, they're very much bandit, you know, kind of either graffiti or kind of signage. You go to Promethea, they're super high tech, they're clean, Designers Republic, Wipeout era kind of like style look. But even here, what was important to me, you know, from the context that the props add to the signs, but, you know, the little things that I don't think people are thinking about, the Rotary Club that sponsored the area, the Reese's Cheeses Adopt a Road kind of sign, all that kind of thing. So anyway, those things to me help ground it and kind of, you know, bring it together. So then you start getting scenes that start becoming a little bit more full-fledged and together. You're seeing the objects and the pieces. You get areas like this. Again, you go back and you dissect all this. It's these strong shapes and these compositions. You know, yeah, you've got all your cool detail and all that stuff, but at the end of the day, you've got this scene that, you know, that's just an in-game screen. That's just a print screen I did. So there's no doctoring or anything on that. But again, you start to realize that, hey, this is working out okay. Then for us, we had to make this. You know, we had to make this big, huge city. Again, all the same principles, you know, relate to all that, okay? Across. Again, we're kind of, you know, the signage becomes this, you know, big kind of sci-fi kind of stuff, right? You know, architecture, what does it mean for these other planets and stuff? Like, okay, like what is the strength it gives? Pandora lets us get pretty obvious with things in regards to like how we use the environment as a character and all those kind of things. You know, from the interior of Sanctuary, the spaceship that you fly around in, well, how was that built? How do we have to build that? You know, what are the pieces that like connect me to it, that ground it? You take away these signs, these little daisies, all these little things, it just becomes another sterile spaceship in a video game. So this shot is one of my favorite in the entire game. It's one of the first things that you see. I think this is a perfect example of Pandora. This is my love letter to Pandora. It's, you know, we have this signage and all of this vibe that kind of, I don't know, I just feel like it tells a story and it connects people. It cuts through a lot of the bullshit and just gets you straight to the point. Like, there's some weird people here, you know, there's all the weird crap. Like, you know, here's the thing, like eat meat, like all this stuff. Like I let the artist just kind of draw that stuff and write that stuff. There's all these tiny little details that are actually written, all these other really weird things. And I'm cool with that. Like everyone should be able to bring their personality and their flavor to that. And I think that's what makes it actually feel unique. So we'll do a real quick thing about guns. Obviously, I'm going to way undersell this. Like, I have a team that I believe has submitted a GDC talk that's going to go really deep into guns. So if you guys are excited about that, look forward to GDC. So again, as we get to the rules about these things, you're seeing a recurring pattern: unique shape, language, and body type, personality and attitude, the brand identity, the logo, and the graphic design. It has to feel functional-ish, like they're kind of, you know, made up, but we also, my gun nut guys that really do all this stuff, but also the product needs to have a promise. When I look at it, I need to be like, I desire it and I understand kind of what it does, right? So when we get into and we start talking about the identity in a shape language, you know, from Atlas and their futuristic stuff to the grounded Jacob's Western stuff, and Tediore and Dahl and Torg and Hyperion, and you look at all these and everything I thought about characters, everything I said about environments comes across in these. The angular polygonal shapes of Hyperion, you know, versus the round tactical Dahl, and all this to the Torg stuff that's built out of engines and all sorts of other like weird crap. And again, the one thing I think that really helps that identity and really come together is the fact that we design a brand, we design the logos, we figure out what all the little icons and the bits and bobs and all that stuff really is. So we put a lot into that so that we feel like it actually inspires the weaponry and all those things. You know, when you kind of see all that together, you start getting these different variables of shapes and guns and all that kind of stuff. But I did want to do a real quick breakdown of Vladof. Vladof is one of my favorite manufacturers in the game, and I thought this would just kind of be an interesting thing for you guys to see the process that we would go through. So we'll fast forward concept. We'll get to a point where we really like these shape languages. Vladov's big deal was always dual barrels. So if it was a grenade launcher, you know, and if you've played the game, you have toggle switches that you can rotate those and you can use the underbarrel or all that kind of stuff. So that was important to us, and the inspirations are probably pretty obvious of where we go to. What I'm really going to fast forward a lot is through the working process. As we're figuring out what these things are, and we're getting low polys of things made, we're going in and we're painting over all these. There's no way we can, as a concept artist, can just draw this accurate and expect a modeler just to be able to do it. You know, so we go in and we have to concept all these pieces and things, because what I'm going to get into is how all these things kind of snap together. So we get to a high poly state. These are 3 different kinds of guns. This is all within the Vladof family. I'm just keeping it towards Vladof, so this kind of, you know, kind of explains what I'm getting at. We get into high polys of the heavies and pistols and snipers. But the thing that I don't think a lot of people realize is, like, this is how we do it. All of these components and all of these pieces, this is just the ARs, the assault rifles, okay? Here's 3 examples of what this builds. So every one of these pieces and objects are all concepted and all built to interlock and interchange to create all the variety of all the guns inside of it, okay? Every one of these things has stats attributed to it. Not every single one of these, but like the body, the grip, the stock, the barrel, the scope, they all have actual attributes. So as our procedural generated system works, those all have values that accurately kind of create what the gun is that you pick up in the game. So that's just kind of a bit of the insanity that there's the heavies, here are the pieces that go into the heavies. And you kind of do look and you see, like, we can't completely BS this. You know, we kind of have to make it work. We kind of have to make it like interlock and you know, come together. Now for the real insanity is getting into the comp mask, okay? So this is a 4K by a 2K texture, or 2K by 4K. So this is everything that you just saw for one gun, okay? So the material system is what drives all of our colorization and all that stuff. So this is all the values and the things that actually denote those things. If you zoom in on some of that, you can start to kind of see the insanity that's happening here, the way that all this is driven through our material system to create our variants and our colors and all that kind of stuff. Now, to have even more fun, this is what the inks look like. So same texture and all that stuff, and like everything we go into and figure that out. Here's a little bit of a zoom in on that, so you can kind of start to understand the insanity that goes into all of this, the pain. You get a gun like this in the end, that's an in-game shot. You know, due to that material system and all those things, we can build this variety in them. We can build that variety in them, all that. So basically, bullet points, that's all the stuff that I went over. As far as some takeaways that I'd like to say is, like, easy isn't always typically better. Sometimes you make a choice that is hard for the team, but is important for the identity of your project or whatever that might be. It might be a technical thing. It might be just like a brute force, right? The shapes are stronger than details, like paramount, in my opinion, in any game. Like, you can fight me on that if you want. I think personality does take effort. You can't just like make a thing. I think you have to like try. You have to put more of yourself into it. I don't think it just comes just because, right? Each of the assets can help tell a story. You know, one on its own is whatever, but you put more of them together, you start to build this thing. Collaboration breeds creativity. Everything that you saw was all the team working together. It wasn't my vision. It was my idea that was carried out by people that had vision. And I think that's something that's really important. It's a collaborative team effort. Don't lose your art heart. You know, this is an art-focused talk. There's no reason to just compromise yourself. You just have to find a way to figure out the inspirations of things you like and what they mean to the product that you're on. And if you care about it, someone else will too. We found that out. But at the same time, like, have fun doing it. Like, enjoy it. Like, love what you're doing and all that. I just want to thank our studio in Frisco and Quebec and all of you guys for coming out to hear me blabber for a while. So anyway, thank you. don't think I have time for QA because I rambled too long.
We're gonna extend you for 5 minutes.
Oh, I got 5 minutes. Okay. Okay. 5 minutes if somebody has questions. One thing I will say too, if people do want to just talk about anything outside of this, feel free to come grab me after this. I'm perfectly happy to chat with anybody.
Yes. Hi. Do you hear me? Okay. My question is, I have 2 questions, in fact. You said that you have a lot of different style. The concept artists were doing like different style. Does it create a problem for that the game be just consistent and the modelers and level artists, they just respect the concept and do the same? Then maybe if every time pass by you to maybe correct or advise what the modelers cannot do, for example. My first question, and my second question is for the textures. I guess the drawing is done in Photoshop, and maybe after for the PBR is like Substance, Painter, Designer, etc. That.
Yeah, I mean, there can definitely be issues that happen with if the concept art is different between artists, but that's one of the main things that we have a really strong style guides and style sheets that basically kind of are like, these are the steps and the processes that you do have to go through. It can be complicated, but in a time where we have to run and we have to do this stuff kind of fast, it's usually the talent and the idea was always more important to me than the consistency, and the consistency comes through our style guides. And yeah, everything that we're texturing in, we're either using Photoshop or we're using Substance too. So that's basically how we've this was our first game since we moved from UE3 to UE4. Substance was kind of like our learning curve, we'll say that, in this game. So anyone else?
So my question is about your pipeline. I just wanted to know, because you were talking a lot about environments and how those are so important. Where do level designers fit in the pipeline? Is it generally that level design will inspire concept artists with paintovers and stuff, or is it usually the concept artists would come first in your pipeline, level designers would come second, and you guys, I don't know, do another paintover and stuff? Just want to know a little bit more about your pipeline there.
Yeah, so sometimes it's a little mutated. A lot of times the concept artist will kind of create the high level idea, and we have our level designers broke out between like actual level designers and level artists. So or world builders, everybody calls it kind of different things, right? So like for the most part, we typically will have a high level concept, and then the level artists will start to work. We work in pods, so we'll try to have a concept artist with a content artist with a level artist or environment artist, however you want to say that. And the artist will typically do breakdowns of the concept, like high level proxies and stuff that will pass over to them. And then typically they'll block something out. We'll look at it, go, all right, let's paint on top of it again. And typically it's kind of like a incestuous like cycle as far as like, hey, sometimes a person just builds out an environment with pieces of proxy pieces we already have, and we do hand that to a concept artist, and they'll figure out what the identity of it is better. So it's not completely like free love and hippie world, but like in a lot of ways, we're pretty open to the way that those ideas can become a reality. So, anyone else? Are we done? Good. 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 Oh, here.
So, hi. I think during GDC 2015, maybe this year, there was a presentation about a new kind of art style for Borderlands 3. It wasn't Borderlands 3, but kind of, we knew it. Was there a reason why it didn't stick in the final product, in the final game?
Yeah, so that experiment, that style, that is something that I did spearhead. It was to further add, basically it was a hatch-based shading, right? So we basically had created all these textures that were all actual hand, because I wanted to see what all the shadows would look like if they were actually hatched, or we tried things with Zipatone and all sorts of things to try to make it look even more like a moving comic. So in the end, it was actually pretty cheap. And this wasn't a screen space thing. This was actually all object-based. So everything was related to the object and not just kind of like a crappy, swimmy screen space thing. But in the end, it needed a lot of hand-holding. It was very light-dependent because wherever light wasn't, there was hatch. So our lighting team is a very talented group, but you think about the amount of lights and things that you needed to go through with our day-night cycle and stuff. Basically, we'd have areas and objects that were super scratchy and super detailed, and I kind of loved it, but other people didn't because they felt it was a little too jarring. It was a little too aggressive. There was too much ink. It was one of the experiments, but like what we were also doing is how light hit things, the outlines would be affected by light. So like there would be heavier shadows on this side of the Sobel outline, and there would be thinner ones here just as we would illustrate or something. And ultimately that just became a little too distracting for people. So I have it in my back pocket. There's some interesting techniques and things that we had in there, but it was a little too aggressive, and we felt like the team it was a little too hard on people's eyes. So, but I'm a guy that loves Mad World, that loves like super aggressive, like stylistic games. So I was okay with it, but other people weren't. So again, that's when, you know, you're working with a team, you're not just working with yourself. So, you know, anyway, so that's kind of a little bit about that. Anyone else?
I think it's the last question.
Thank you. So I was wondering, how do you make worlds that are different enough to be entertaining while keeping them coherent with the rest of the game?
So yeah, that's actually a big challenge, especially for a game franchise that we were pretty much always terrain-based. Promethea, which I've actually submitted to talk to GDC, which is a really deep dive into Promethea, which is all hard surface. There's very little fauna or foliage at all. There's very little terrain, because if you guys build in Unreal or other games, we know terrain is the great communicator. You know, it grounds everything and is easy. And anybody that's built something that's entirely hard surface, it can be a real pain with a lot of pieces, and terrain can carry a lot. So the consistency was a really difficult thing, because if you have materials that are a lot more like futuristic or cleaner or something, the art style, we had a lot of people infighting that's not Borderlands, or it's got to be this, or there has to be duct tape on everything. And it came to a point where for us the cohesion was in the style, and we had to figure out like because the outline would always be present, because the inks would always be present, that it was something that kept things cohesive. But to me, my job was to make sure between these planets it still felt like Borderlands, and that it still had those tenets it had, that, you know, if I'm talking about that signage, or I'm talking about that personality or that attitude or the shape language, that we had to change it. But I think we did a pretty good job in Borderlands 3. We had 48 maps in that game, which was almost twice the amount of maps in Borderlands 2. So like, I think we did a pretty good job given the range of the varieties in it, but I know we can do better now. So, but consistency is hard. It's hard for any game. And for us, our style was, as time consuming as it was kind of actually the thing that kind of kept us unified, honestly. So, yeah. Okay. Well, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you guys coming out. So, by the way, both of our studios are hiring right now, and if anybody does have any questions, feel free to come yell at me. So thanks a lot.